Well, it just became clearer to me through my life that the framers' vision was correct, which is that limited government, their idea of limited government and maximum personal liberty, was based on a foundation of religious liberty.
Religious liberty as the foundation for a free society. Former Attorney General William Barr weighs in on the significance of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It was one of several topics we discussed in an exclusive interview for EWTN News In Depth. The former Attorney General has a long history of service to the United States under two administrations in very different moments in American history, and experience advising major tech corporations on government enforcement matters as a quickly growing industry changed from cable to wireless to digital. Barr is the second person in history to serve twice as U.S. Attorney General. He was first Attorney General under President George H.W. Bush from 1991 to 1993. During his tenure, he helped establish new enforcement policies in a number of areas, including for financial institutions, civil rights, and antitrust merger guidelines. From 1994 to 2008, Barr left the government and served as General Counsel, leading the legal, regulatory, and government affairs activities for the GTE Corporation, which later became Verizon Communications. In 2019, Barr was sworn in as the 85th Attorney General under President Donald Trump. In this role, Barr was thrust into the spotlight, first as the Robert Mueller investigation into alleged Trump-Russia collusion was released, then again during the 2020 presidential election. In an unusual break with President Trump, Barr said the Justice Department found no evidence of widespread voter fraud. Barr recently released a book mostly documenting his service as Attorney General for President Trump, but also including his tenure under President Bush. It takes the reader behind the scenes of seminal moments during his career. The former AG sat down with us to discuss education, religious liberty, big tech, and the preservation of the peaceful transfer of power. Here's Bill Barr on the record. The way that you describe religious freedom, it's more philosophical than dogmatic. How has your Catholicism influenced your views on religious freedom?
Well, I think I believe generally in religious freedom, and I think society's better off with people believing, whether it be Christianity, Judaism, or any other religion. But religion has always been a central part of my life. I was raised in the Catholic religion. I went to Catholic school, grammar school, and it gave me a strong foundation. And it was clear to me that people thrive when they have a religious foundation. It puts things in perspective for them. It tells them that there is a purpose to life, and it helps them get through the challenges that every life has to face. And so it's important that we preserve the faith, and in this secular age, it's under attack.
Let's go back to something that you mentioned, being raised in Catholic formation. Mm-hmm. You go to great lengths to thank the sisters that educated you. Yeah. And you tell a beautiful story of reuniting with one of them. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that the crisis of religious freedom has one kind of turning point, which is education. Why did you think that was so important?
Well, because in the United States, we have public education, and in European countries, you don't have to give up sending your kids to religious schools in order to get publicly funded education.
You mentioned England as one of those examples.
And supposedly we fled England for religious liberty, but in England you can go to Catholic school, Church of England school, Muslim school, Sikh school, Hindu school, and it's paid for by the state. The United States, however, says the only thing that's publicly funded are the state schools. And that sort of worked in a clumsy sort of way for 100 years, from the mid-1800s to 1960, because they were fundamentally reflected to the Judeo-Christian tradition of the country. But since 1960, they first started stripping away Christianity, and now, over the last couple of decades, they've been trying to substitute secular ideology to explain morality and what the principles they think people should live by, and they're trying to introject into the school doctrines and ideas that are fundamentally subversive of a religious viewpoint. And so that's one of the challenges that parents who want to raise their children in a religious faith face, the public school influence and indoctrination.
You mentioned this secular ideology, secular humanism, in your book, and how you have these new protections that were afforded for religion and now were afforded to secular humanism as a religion. Explain that to me a little more.
Well, there are two clauses, as you know very well, in the Constitution. There's the Free Exercise Clause, which says that the state cannot interfere with someone's exercise of their religion. And then there's the Establishment Clause, which says that the state cannot establish something as a religion. And I think we've gotten to the point that clearly are interfering in religion, so the Free Exercise Clause is implicated. But I think we've now gotten to the state where you could, the situation where you can say that the government is establishing religion, a form of secular humanism. And in the past, they've treated that as a religion. When it comes to getting out of the draft or something like that, they say, okay, well, you don't have to believe in God. That's really the equivalent of a religious faith. Now they're trying to establish secular humanism as sort of the official creed of the country, sort of a theocracy. And I think that violates the Establishment Clause.
So they're first given all of these protections for their speech and assembly and even not to have to participate in conflict, but then they're not in any way stopped the way that Christians and Muslims and Hindus, et cetera, are stopped by the Establishment Clause.
Right.
So that's problematic. Your chapter on religious freedom starts with a beautiful picture. It's actually a very scary picture of what aliens would think if they saw the Little Sisters of the Poor.
Right.
How has this portrayal of the Little Sisters, now synonymous with the fight for religious freedom, shifted in your time, in your tenure in two administrations with a break in between, where religious freedom used to be one thing and now it's something else that vilifies people like the Little Sisters of the Poor, beautiful ladies?
Right. Well, it goes back to the threat today is not that people of faith are trying to impose their religion on other people. It's the opposite. It's that the secularists are trying to impose their viewpoints on people of faith, and they just can't tolerate pluralism and people, having their own views and moral systems. And so they're trying to they take delight in having people who disagree with them and forcing them to bend the knee, to concede their point, to engage, doctors to participate in abortion, even if it's contrary to their conscience, or a baker who bake a cake for a gay couple, even though that violates his conscience. They want people to bend the knee, and that is the danger to religious liberty, the use of coercion against those of faith. They say they didn't like it. They felt that when there were laws passed that restricted their activities, it was the religious views of the majority being imposed on them. But they're turning around and doing exactly the same thing they accused, religion of doing.
Let's talk about your time at Verizon. You were General Counsel of Verizon for about 15 years. You oversaw a merger, maybe two?
Many mergers, yeah.
How did that time influence what you ended up having to do to curtail the effects of big tech, or the beginnings of that?
Well, certainly, it taught me a lot about the new technology that was emerging, the internet technology. Verizon was at the forefront of that. And it's changed the face of communications in this country. So much of what we do now, whether it be shopping or education or research or public discourse, is now done over the internet, digitally. And I've been concerned about the extent to which those markets are increasingly under the market dominance of just a handful of very, very large companies. And it's something that I think there's bipartisan agreement. That's one of the things I found in this serving again, is that how much both parties are concerned about the market dominance of just a handful of companies. And they control what used to be the village green. The public square is now a digital green. And they can be gatekeepers, and we see the censorship that's involved in that. And so we have to do something about it, and my book lays out some suggestions of what we can do.
You talk about the 3 dangers that Google, Amazon, all of these companies pose. What are those 3 specific dangers?
So the first danger is sort of the classical economic power, their ability to dominate those markets economically. The second has to do with their capture of all the personal information of their customers, the mountains of data they have about individuals, and their ability to use that to strengthen their position, but also to manipulate people. Unconsciously, people are sort of shepherded through the internet because they know what buttons to push based on the information they have about individuals. So they can influence people. And then the third danger is that we're not talking about a market for vacuum cleaners or toasters. We're talking about the market of ideas, the marketplace of ideas, as I say, the village green. And the framers believed that the great bulwark for our freedom was the multiplicity of voices and the fact there are just so many different sources, but as it becomes more concentrated, we lose that.
We do lose that. And you mentioned that the regulators then, those who could be helpful in curtailing some of this, are 10 years behind the times.
Right. So my experience in the industry was that the most reactionary force in any marketplace are the regulators. They're usually about 10 years behind the time. And by the time they get around to addressing a problem, the problem has changed in a way that is no longer susceptible to the solution. So that's one of the problems here. This has grown up right under the nose. This market power has grown up right under the nose of the regulators.
Well, let's talk about some of the political players.
Okay.
I think that if we sit back, we take a deep breath. Americans are feeling great unrest. They're feeling great uneasiness with the power of their vote. So I want to take the time now to ease their minds a little bit. What do you think tipped the scale with the violence and the unrest in the last election, and Biden coming into power? What tipped the scale there?
Well, going back to my confirmation hearing, I said in a very sharply divided country, we have to make sure there's integrity in our elections because people will not trust the outcome if they don't think it's fair. Mm-hmm. And what we have going for us is this peaceful transfer of power in our country. We can't lose that. And that's why I opposed all the novel practices that were being injected into the 2020 election. Because if people see the safeguards diluted, they're not going to trust the outcome, whether or not you can prove fraud, if they feel that all the safeguards have been stripped away or weakened. So that's why it's important. And now, there are a lot of different ways that the elections are can be skewed. Some are just a question of the level playing field. So, for example, if a party takes advantage of making rules that, we're not going to use IDs or we're going to allow ballots that come in late and so forth, that's basically trying to give advantage to their constituency, a particular party. And the parties have to fight over that and make sure up front that the rules are fair, because once those rules are adopted, those are the rules of the game. And we have to win or lose an election under those rules. To have a fair election, the rules have to be in place at the time of the vote, because going back and trying to unscramble the egg is very hard to do. Trying to find the fraud, prove the fraud, or improper voting. And so
there are time limits on that.
There are time limits. In a presidential election, you only have 5 or 6 weeks between the time the election is over and the time the votes are certified. And so you really have to be disciplined and be ready to go in and challenge them after the fact. But the more important approach is to make sure the rules are proper and observed during the election or at the time of election. And there, the parties have to be very active.
Your career gives you full knowledge of the spectrum of what can be done by governors, by attorney generals at the state level. What would you suggest they do?
Well, I think the governors like Governor Kemp in Georgia and Governor Abbott in Texas, who have insisted on tightening up the rules, are doing absolutely the right thing. And we need to have that in all the key states where there tend to be very tight, closely decided elections.
And is that the key, is looking for places where the elections are tight and trying to clean up the rules there?
Right. The states have responsibility for that. I'm not for sending everything over to the federal government. The states each should be focused on tightening up their rules.